All of us at some point in our lives seek God's favor. We want to please Him, live under His protection, and experience His goodness in every aspect of our walk. But what do we really need to do to earn God's favor? Today we'll explore 5 fundamental principles that the Bible teaches us to live according to God's heart: faith, obedience, discipline, boldness, and fear. Faith is the foundation of any relationship with God. It is the starting point that connects us to the Lord and allows us to experience His favor. Faith is not just a superficial belief, but complete trust in that which we cannot see, in that which seems impossible to human eyes. In Hebrews 11 verse 6, we find a powerful truth: without faith it is impossible to please God. This teaches us that faith is essential to pleasing the Lord, and without it we cannot enjoy His fullness. Faith is a total surrender to the unseen, an unshakable certainty that even when everything seems difficult, God is in control and will fulfill His promises. Throughout the Bible, we see many examples of men and women who lived by faith and found favor with God as a result. One striking example is Abraham, known as the father of faith. Abraham believed in God's promises, even when reality seemed to contradict God's promise. He was called to leave his land and his family, not knowing where he was going, trusting only that God would guide him. This unshakable faith made Abraham the model for how we should position ourselves in the face of uncertainty. Even in adversity, when everything seemed impossible, Abraham remained steadfast, knowing that the one who had promised was faithful to fulfill it. In the same way, our faith must be unshakable. True faith is not shaken by circumstances, but rests on God's promises. When we believe, regardless of the difficulties we face, we honor God. And by honoring Him with our faith, we experience His favor and His presence in our lives. Faith, in and of itself, is essential, but without obedience, it becomes empty. God seeks not only those who believe in His existence, but those who are willing to follow His instructions with humility and reverence. Faith and obedience go hand in hand. True faith manifests itself in concrete actions, in a willingness to listen to God's voice and act in accordance with His will. As it is written in Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 to 2, "If you obey the voice of the Lord your God and keep all His commandments, all these blessings will come upon you." This verse reminds us that there is a direct connection between obeying God and experiencing His blessings. Obedience is not something we do when it is convenient for us. It is not about following God only when everything is clear or easy. Obedience requires that we submit to God's will, even when we do not understand His ways. Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6 advises us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. This means that, at many times, we will be called to obey even without fully understanding, trusting that God knows what is best for us. The ultimate example of obedience was set by Jesus. As the Son of God Himself, He could have chosen a different path, but in His great humility, He submitted Himself completely to the will of the Father. Philippians 2 verse 8 tells us, "And being found in appearance as a man, He humbled Himself, and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Jesus' obedience was a sacrificial obedience. He accepted the cross to fulfill God's redemptive plan for humanity. His attitude teaches us that obeying God often means sacrificing our personal wills and desires, trusting that the Father's will is perfect. In the same way, we are called to follow this example of submission. Our obedience demonstrates our love for God and our faith in His plans. By surrendering ourselves completely to His will, we experience a full life marked by the presence and favor of the Lord. Being faithful to God requires spiritual discipline. We cannot expect a transformed life, guided by the Holy Spirit, without dedicating time and effort to cultivating practices that bring us closer to Him daily. Spiritual discipline is the commitment to invest in our relationship with God through essential habits such as prayer, reading the Bible, and fasting. These practices are the foundation for shaping our character and strengthening us in faith. Prayer is our direct communication with God. It is the moment when we speak to the Father and open our hearts to Him, seeking His guidance and strength. Reading the Word is equally fundamental. The Bible is God's manual for our lives, teaching us how to live righteously and please Him. As the psalmist wrote in Psalm 119 verse 105, Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And fasting in turn helps us submit our flesh to the Spirit, creating space for greater sensitivity to God's voice. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 9 verse 27, reminds us of the importance of self-discipline. But I keep my body under control and keep it in subjection, so that by preaching to others I myself will not become a disqualified person. He knew that without spiritual discipline, even the most fervent believer could stray or lose his way. God is pleased with those who are steadfast in their pursuit of Him. Discipline is the fertile ground where faith and obedience grow and bear fruit for the kingdom. It is through this daily dedication that we experience God's favor, for He rewards those who zealously seek Him continually. May we cultivate this discipline in our lives, allowing God to transform us, perfect us, and guide us toward a life of purpose and holiness. Seeking God's favor also requires boldness. Boldness is having the courage to believe in God's promises, even when everything around us seems impossible. It means remaining steadfast in faith, even when the world tells us otherwise, when circumstances seem to challenge us. In Joshua 1 verse 9, God speaks directly to the heart of Joshua, a leader who faced the immense challenge of leading his people to the promised land. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you. These words show us that boldness comes from the certainty that God is on our side. Boldness challenges us to step out of our comfort zone, to take steps toward the unknown, knowing that we are not alone. When David, a young shepherd, set out to face the giant Goliath, he acted with a boldness that could only come from God. While the soldiers of Israel trembled with fear, David trusted the Lord completely. He knew that the battle was not his but God's. His boldness was not in confidence in his own abilities, but in the power of God. Another example of boldness in God was Peter, who, upon seeing Jesus walking on the water, asked to come to him. By stepping out of the boat and taking the first step onto the water, Peter demonstrated courageous faith. Even though he wavered for a moment, his initial boldness was honored by the presence of Christ, who caught him as he began to sink. Boldness in God does not mean the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward in spite of it, trusting that when we take the first step, God will be there for us. It is this kind of courageous faith that attracts God's favor and allows us to experience great things in His presence. The fear of God is not a paralyzing fear but a profound reverence. It is understanding and respecting God's holiness, majesty, and authority over all things. It is living with the certainty that He is the Creator of all, that our actions are seen by Him, and that every choice we make reflects our respect for His sovereignty. In Proverbs 9 verse 10 we read, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." This teaches us that the fear of God is the beginning of all true knowledge, for we recognize that our lives are in His hands. The fear of God leads us to a higher standard of living. When we live in the awareness of His presence, we reject sin not out of fear of punishment, but out of respect and love for who He is. Living in the fear of the Lord causes us to seek holiness, turning away from temptations and paths that lead us away from Him. This fear keeps us humble, reminding us that without God, we are limited, and that it is only by His grace that we can sustain ourselves. Psalm 111 verse 10 reinforces that, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Good understanding has all those who do His precepts." When we live with the fear of God, we show that we recognize His authority and that we are willing to submit our will to His. This reverence brings us closer to the Lord, and thus we find His favor, for He honors those who truly respect Him and place themselves under His sovereignty. Throughout this journey, we have seen that to earn God's favor we need 5 fundamental pillars: faith, obedience, discipline, boldness, and fear. Faith connects us to God, obedience aligns us with His will, discipline strengthens us spiritually, boldness moves us to act with courage, and fear keeps us reverent and humble. When these 5 elements are present in our lives, we attract God's favor and live in fullness, guided by His presence and direction.